Okay, I will start. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining today's press conference. I'm Harjeet Singh, Strategic Advisor and Asia Lead for the Fossil Fuel TT Initiative, and I'll moderate the press conference today. As you know, we are standing at a critical juncture. Asia is currently facing an existential energy crisis affecting our homes, our industries, and our economies. So to begin with, I'm going to share just a few slides to set the context, and then we will go to our panelists. So we have an esteemed list of panelists who are going to be sharing their perspectives. So let me start with a quick context setting presentation. I hope you see my screen and it's also full screen. Zoe, if you can confirm, then I can proceed.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. So while we are going to talk about the impact of the war on Asia, before that, we should also understand the global context. The reality is that when we talk about fossil fuel production, we see it happening not inconsistent with 1.5 degree or even 2 degree target that we had set. And the plans are way beyond what we were supposed to be doing to bring down our dependence on fossil fuels. While we celebrate the renewable energy adoption in the region and beyond, but the reality is, if you look at globally, our dependence on fossil fuels has not shifted. So the increased adoption and expansion of renewable energy is actually feeding the increased demand. And this is worrying. And unless and until renewables start displacing fossil fuels, we will not be able to deal with the climate crisis that we are facing. Now, of course, the crisis trigger, we see how the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz due to war in the Middle East has cut off 1/5 of the global petroleum supply. But from a regional perspective, let's also understand that nearly 90% of oil and over 80% of LNG passing through the Strait of Hormuz is bound for Asia. And for countries like Japan and the Philippines, the exposure is over 90%, very much in line with the Asia number. And if you look at Southeast Asia, that imports 56% of its crude oil from the Middle East. So dependence is massive. And we also saw unprecedented price surges. Of course, it's going up and down, but the fact is it's over $100 per barrel, and which has really affected the economies and put so many millions of households into hardships. Now, when we look at the economic devastation, the escalation is causing output losses, and the estimate is that it's going to be between $97 to $299 billion in Asia Pacific region, which is close to 0.3 to 0.8 drop in regional GDP as per UNDP. So clearly we are seeing a humanitarian emergency. And again, UNDP says that the conflict is putting 8.8 million people in the Asia Pacific at the risk of falling into poverty globally due to the rising cost of electricity, food, and transport. And all of us are seeing that reality around us. Then there are currency and inflation shocks. So the crisis also devalued currencies of the Philippines and Thailand by up to 3%. We are seeing trade deficits widening. We are also seeing how regional inflation is projected to rise to 3.6% this year itself, according to ADB. And we're also seeing how governments are now forced to spend their public money, which means it's draining their resources and which is affecting their national budgets. Cambodia, for instance, slashed state institutional budgets by 30% just to fund fossil fuel subsidies. So that's the reality. It is really draining resources. While we are talking about the trigger and the impact of war on Asia, it's also important to look at the pre-existing energy poverty that we have been facing. The reality is that 940 million people in Asia experience frequent power interruptions. There is a massive access gap that we are looking at. 350 million people lack adequate electricity access, while 133 million people have no electricity whatsoever. And then we also see there are vulnerable nations like Myanmar, and we also see how energy deficits are concentrated in even the large countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, India, and then, of course, Cambodia and Pakistan. We also see how it is affecting poor people, and especially because they're dependent on imported fossil fuels, and the cost is fairly high when we look at their monthly budget. Having said that, this is also an opportunity and a case for transition. And this is where we see how Asia has been leading on renewable energy capacity. And we are having 74% of all renewable energy capacity added globally. Of course, China leads the pack, but we are also seeing that momentum in several other countries. We also see how the generation of power from solar is now significantly more cost effective than relying on volatile imported gas. We also see how solar, and we will hear from our panelist, growth in Pakistan since 2020 has allowed the country to avoid $12 billion in oil and gas import costs. So clearly, if we adopt renewable energy, it helps us deal with our balance of payments and so on, and our dollars not really going out. And then rejecting a fossil fuel lock-in, which is very much a threat right now. We are seeing examples, and I'm sure we'll hear from Neeti and others on Southeast Asia. But we are, this case study of a developer requesting to cancel LNG project and moving towards renewable energy is something really very encouraging. And then, of course, we are going to Santa Marta and the next few days, and we see that as a huge opportunity to promote renewables and a shift away from fossil fuels. And we are also demanding a global framework in the form of a fossil fuel treaty to make that happen. So this is the first step that we are taking, and right now the discussion is happening in the context of war, but also looking at something more positive. Let me stop here, and we have an excellent line of panelists. Some are here. I think most of here. So I'm going to start introducing them one by one. So we have Ms. Liddy Nakpil. Liddy is a veteran Filipino human rights activist and coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. She's a leading voice globally, demanding debt cancellation, grant-based climate finance, just energy transition for the global South. We have Neeti Nesadurai, who serves as a director and regional director of Climate Action Network Southeast Asia, representing a vast network of civil society organizations. He has spent decades advancing climate resilience, sustainable development policies, and coordinated energy transitions across the ASEAN region. We have Mustafa Talpur. He is the head of policy advocacy and campaigns for Oxfam International in Asia. He specializes in tackling the structural causes of economic inequality and poverty, and he's a staunch advocate for ensuring that marginalized workers and vulnerable communities are protected through the global shift away from fossil fuels, and they're able to deal with the climate crisis. We also have Dr. Abid Suleri. He's the executive director of the Sustainable Development Policy Institute, SDPI, which is a premier institute, and he's an expert on sustainable development, food security, and political economy in Pakistan. He frequently advises national governments and international bodies on building climate resilient infrastructure and mitigating the economic fallouts of climate disasters. We will also be joined by Barish soon. Barish Hassan Chaudhary is an environmental lawyer and the campaign and policy coordinator at the Bangladesh Environmental Lawyers Association, BELA. He actively utilizes strategic litigation against harmful fossil fuel expansions and advocates for policies that center local communities in the transition to renewable energy. Last but not the least, Megha Maskez. She is based in Nepal. She's an Asia campaigner for the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. She's spearheading the regional advocacy and grassroots mobilization. She works with governments and civil society in the region to map out equitable nation-specific pathways for phasing out fossil fuels and embracing renewable alternatives. So to begin with, I would like to start with Liddy. So Liddy, APMDD has been instrumental in coordinating civil society efforts in Asia as well as globally. So let's start with the big picture. As world leaders gather in the next few days in Santa Marta, Colombia, what are the core non-negotiables and expectations that the grassroots and civil society are bringing into the Santa Marta conference? Over to you,
Well,
Liddy.
first of all, Harjeet, I'd like to emphasize that we are welcoming very much this international conference. It's a historic milestone, and I know that, of course, civil society was also, especially Treaty, has been behind supporting and encouraging the governments of Colombia to spearhead the convening of the international conference. So we have very high hopes that this conference will signal to the rest of the world, the rest of the governments, who are not joining in Santa Marta, either because they haven't been invited, because they didn't express firm and explicit commitment to the transitioning away from fossil fuels. We hope that this will signal the fact that there is this very strong push for the transitioning to happen rapidly, equitably, and in a just manner, which is really the core of what civil society wants to bring to Santa Marta. It cannot just be a transitioning. It has to be rapid, equitable, and just. And part of that rapid and equitable is recognizing that we are not equal in terms of responsibility. So this very often quoted principle of common but differentiated responsibility should lie at the heart of this transition. And part of this acknowledgement of differentiated responsibility is the acknowledgement, and this is actually a legal obligation under the convention, that the global north countries, their elites, corporations, and governments owe it to the global south to provide climate finance for several things, including the equitable and just transition out of fossil fuels. This is not only climate finance, of course, about the energy transition. As you know, we are together in the campaign for filling the loss and damage fund, also for the provision of climate finance for adaptation and other elements of the just transition that is not just about fossil fuels. So that is one major strong message we want to bring. We hope the governments in Santa Marta in their conference will deliver a strong message around that. So far, the text that we have been seeing coming out of the official government website, for instance, doesn't really make an explicit reference to climate finance. So that is something that we will be very strongly calling for and asking for. The other one, and I hope I'm not going to cover other speakers' focus, but I'd really just like to mention that the transitioning needs a very clear plan and roadmap, because this is not going to happen just by good intentions, or this is not going to happen if we are just simply relying on market solutions, or leaving it to the private sector to mainly spearhead this. And the reason why it is governments that must convene is because it's governments must lead. And that means that leadership means government should have clear roadmaps. This roadmap was a big issue in in the Belém COP, we realized, of course, and recognized that many developing country governments didn't want to talk about a roadmap because there was no finance on the table. It's a very valid concern. But they should spearhead putting out a roadmap that clearly includes finance, but also includes very definite timelines and milestones of what needs to be achieved. And this represents, of course, the intent to develop a really clear plan for a managed phase out. I think that is one key word that should also be repeated. If we don't manage it, if we don't drive it, and in this driving, governments must lead, it's not just going to happen simply through market instruments and involving the private sector. Governments must lead, and we need clear roadmaps. I'd leave it at that because there's many other messages, of course, that my colleagues will be able to articulate.
Thank you so much, Lydie, for the overview and in fact, particularly highlighting our expectations in terms of finance and roadmap from Santa Marta, so that it's not just a one-off conference. So, and we'll talk more about it. But I want to come back to you before I go to Niti. You're from the Philippines, and Philippines declared an energy emergency because of the war in Iran. If you can share some of the realities from the Philippines and how it connects with Santa Marta, and particularly the urgency of scaling up national renewable energy. So please help us connect with this reality and be going to Santa Marta.
Yeah. Well, so first, before I talk about the energy and economic realities and fallout, I'd also like to say that we have millions of Filipinos in the Middle East. Our migrant workers, actually Asian migrants, represent the largest number, probably almost the sheer number of migrant workers are Asians. So we also want to highlight the humanitarian aspects of the impacts of this war for our people who are not in our countries, but are actually located in that region. So the Philippines is really actually typical of many Asian countries, southern countries, who are almost entirely dependent on imported oil and gas. Now, we have very, very few natural gas in the Philippines. So it's like maybe 98%, if not more, of oil and gas needs are imported. And I mentioned this reality because what this crisis is telling us or reminding us is that the phase out of fossil fuels, we are not just talking about its climate implications, although that in itself is already profoundly, affecting our survival as human beings in this planet. But in the immediate, we're also talking about the dependence on fossil fuels as a very dangerous thing for the immediate economic survival of our people. In this case, for instance, being hostage or beholden to an imported fuel that is actually also vulnerable to very price volatility in the global markets means our entire economy is hostage to what's happening to fossil fuels and the supply of fossil fuels. So in the Philippine case, because that is what it generally happens, any kind of upward change in the price of oil and gas means it's changes in all sorts of products, especially staples and basic commodities. And also the transportation, we're not just talking about transport of goods, transportation of people. It's now I'm in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and I'm seeing how it impacts on the transportation needs of ordinary people and what that does. And not to mention, of course, on goods and prices. So we can't be hostage to this. And for immediate economic reasons, we need to transition out of fossil fuels and switch to renewables. That's the only way. I can understand why governments are in Asia, some of them are falling back on coal because that is what is there, and gas supply, oil supply. I mean, many of our capacity for refinery and storage is very limited. So the Philippines is not rationing yet, but it will soon because we only have a 2 to 3 months supply capacity for storage and refinery. So for these immediate reasons, there is no response but to really advance renewables. The the fallback on coal should be very, very temporary, existing coal, and it doesn't make sense to build new coal plants because the building RE plants takes half the time it takes, even less, to build coal plants. So they can't even say that coal is the convenient replacement. New coal is a convenient replacement. RE is a more convenient replacement for what we need in terms of energy supply. I just want to add that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Liddy, and also getting into those granularities and challenging some of the notions that exist. This is the time to further depend on fossil fuels. No, we don't need to. I would like to go to Niti, following up from what Liddy said, and let's go further into Southeast Asia regional perspective. So, Niti, how is this reliance on imported fossil fuels paralyzing, if I can use that word, the Southeast Asian region? And connect also that with the expectations and the unified stance that Southeast Asian leaders must take at Santa Marta. Over to you.
Yeah, certainly a very pertinent question, Harjeet. Southeast Asia has been characterized as being one of the fastest economic growing regions in the world. And a lot of this economic growth has come with a heavy reliance on fossil fuels, especially for electricity generation and for transportation. And now, when you talk about the paralysis, it shows that this dependence on fossil fuels has fully exposed the region to external disruptions. In this case, the war going on against Iran. And the other thing to note is also some countries are probably affected more than the others. We have, within the region, three countries which are fossil fuel producing and exporting nations, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. Irrespective, and in some countries already the threat of petrol stations closing down is a reality. Irrespective of whether you're fossil fuel producing or the majority, which is not, in general, the paralysis has led to financial pain. So this is both, for consumers and small businesses. For consumers, higher prices at the pumps, and especially for diesel, and even increasing electricity tariffs. Same for businesses, especially those in agriculture, which are heavily dependent on diesel for transport. So costs have been going up. And of course, the pain is also felt by governments because those countries which subsidize the cost of fossil fuels at the petrol tank, like Malaysia, that subsidy has gone up, massively. So they've had to cut back on the quotas for the subsidies. And for the other countries which collect tax from, have a collection on tax on fossil fuels, that taxes has to be reduced. So the government's also uh, having a reduction in income. And then there's also the other aspect of weakening in the currencies, the national currencies, because they have to pay more for the import of these fossil fuels. And this has also led to policies, reminiscent of the COVID era of governments for requiring their staff to work from home so that they can cut down on the transport costs. In terms of how this, so this basically serves as a wake-up call to Southeast Asia leaders. And because before this, the trend is to continue with fossil fuel expansion. And, there's the narrative that moving away from fossil fuels will affect economic development. And, and while coal was highlighted as, that everyone accepted coal is bad, we need to transition away from coal, the narrative then became that we need, gas is a transition fuel in Southeast Asia. And this has also now showed that, this argument just does not carry any other water because, long-term lock-in, as the example you gave yourself, Harjeet, how this in Vietnam, where the person who's supposed to develop the gas plants is now declined. And it also leads to long-term lock-in, and and probably also leads to debt, especially as the cost of renewables keep on coming down. And so this will not end well. So, like I said, this is a wake-up call, and it's for governments in South Asia to take a paradigm shift. So what do they need to do? The first thing Southeast Asia leaders going to Santa Marta need to recognize that Southeast Asia is a renewable energy rich region, and that we can meet our needs through renewable energy resources, and they have to seize the opportunity to advocate for a transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy with energy efficiency. And as Lydie also mentioned, with this just, which is inclusive, which is equitable, and which is sustainable. And the other thing they need to also bring into the language is the need to focus on energy sovereignty, not so much security. And the difference is energy sovereignty, where you are able to meet your energy needs based on your own country's ability to generate the electricity demand or the fuel demand which is required. And one very interesting comment, one interesting fact I'd like to share is the Indonesian president himself. Indonesia is the world's largest exporter of coal, one of the largest users of coal. And he has come out and said, now is an opportunity to transition to renewable energy while announcing a 100-gigawatt solar power project. And so I think the signal is already coming. And even in Cambodia, they've already, even before this crisis started, talking about how they're creating this carbon neutral island, which will have, almost minimal or zero dependence on fossil fuels. So the point here, the second point, our Southeast Asia leaders need to make it in Santa Marta is that transitioning away from fossil fuels is actually an economic justification. There's an economic argument to it because you're going to save billions in fossil fuel imports and withstand shocks, to be able to withstand shocks and create energy sovereignty. And the other thing is also they have to use this opportunity to reject false solutions which are actively being promoted in the region, such as carbon capture and storage, ammonia coal firing, clean coal technology, as a means of advocating, as a means of enabling the continued use of fossil fuels in the region. So they need to promote a paradigm shift and approach, for a long-term away. They need to advocate for a paradigm shift away from the approach of a long-term reliance on fossil fuels for electricity generation and transportation and economic development, and make the economic case for decarbonization with the transitioning away from fossil fuels to renewable energy with energy efficiency while displacing fossil fuels, not just adding on but and displacing. And of course, with this, looking at things like having bringing renewable energy into grid integration and investing in battery energy storage systems. And even we have one advantage ASEAN has is that we have actively working on creating an ASEAN power grid, which connects all the countries in ASEAN. And there is already economic data that developing the ASEAN power grid could generate $800 billion worth of cost savings with decarbonization. So the economic argument is very clear, and we need to follow through on this. Back to you, Harjit.
Thank you so much, Niti, for sharing all those details and specifically talking about the potential that the region has. You're going to be in Santa Marta, so I'm sure you'll be engaging with your leaders and holding them to account. I would now like to move to South Asia. So where we have seen massive price shocks as well. So Mustafa, if I come to you, and Oxfam works a lot on inequality. So please share your perspective on how is the war-induced energy crisis impacting the most marginalized communities in South Asia? And how can Santa Marta ensure transition to renewable energy, which is genuinely just and equitable? Over to you, Mustafa.
Okay, thank you, Harjit. Yeah, just let me give you a few data points. As you already mentioned, the oil price shock. It went. It the peak in March went actually 120 USD per barrel, and this is the highest since 2008 financial crisis. And we saw 45% plus increase in oil and about 55% increase in the gas prices. We haven't talked much its impact on the fertilizer and food security. Um, and there are short-term impacts, but there are also long-term impacts that are still yet to be unfolded. Because communities in South Asia and the people generally we have seen, they have a short-term shock responsive measures, but as the impacts unfold in the long term, then we will know as it happened in the COVID impacts that's still ongoing. But just few data on the oil import. Pakistan imports 80% plus oil. It includes also LNG from Qatar, about 25%. It is already seeing the impact. In 2024, Pakistan's oil import bill was about 15 billion USD. It could rise 8 to 9 billion in 2026 with this price rising. Sri Lanka, as we saw, was on the collapse of a couple of years ago due to the economic crisis. Its energy dependency is about 58% on imported oil, heavily on diesel for its electricity production. And they have been slowly building their foreign exchange reserves. Again, thanks for the IMF. But that might again at the risk if this bill increases. Bangladesh 39% is energy dependency on imported oil. Nepal, and then three countries in South Asia are landlocked. So Nepal, Bhutan, and Afghanistan. So they don't only pay the market prices when the prices rise, but they also pay the transition fees. And many times we see the long queues in these countries. And I mean, I have observed in Nepal when it happens. Um, so so these countries are highly dependent on these fossil fuel import mainly from Middle East. And as Riddhi mentioned, 80 to 90% of the Hormuz traffic is actually for Asia and our dependency. So I think there will be 4 or 5 major impacts of that. One, of course, as I mentioned, on current account deficit, the countries have to pay more, and they're already struggling, like Sri Lanka, Pakistan. Uh, the other major issue will be again debt cycle coming in. So we have to borrow more to pay the oil bill, and we are locked into that situation. Rather than countries spending that money on their countries, on the people, to reduce the rich poor gap and alleviate poverty, they have to pay back the debt. Of course, the remittance shock. Many countries in South Asia, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they have also India, labor force in the Middle East. So far, the data is saying that it hasn't impacted much in Pakistan, but there might be a data lag as well. So on the one hand, you pay more for rising cost of the oil, you reduce remittances, you have to borrow more, and you are locked into again a debt cycle. But more importantly than energy security, Pakistan has already started load shedding. Some of its imported RLNG plants are being closed. I think there might be similar issues in other countries as well. So the people who really cause less to this conflict or climate crisis are the most being affected. Either it's a climate breakdown, climate shock, or the energy crisis. So their future opportunity for the right to development is being really affected. And inflation, poverty, and food security, as I already mentioned. So if fertilizer price is going up, it will affect the future food production in many South Asian countries, and South Asia is a sub-region with stark reality of food insecurity, hunger, malnutrition, and poverty. So these implications are going to be increased into that one. And just give you one that Pakistan Institute of Development Economics concluded that every $10 increase in global oil prices can raise Pakistan's annual petroleum import bill approximately to $2 billion US. So that is at the one side kind of impact. The other is, as Niti already mentioned, and also Harji, there's a coal regression. There are at least what we see about 8-9 countries, including Bangladesh, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Thailand, Germany, Italy, have already announced to plan increase coal use, or reverse back to the coal phase out, or slow down their coal phase out, looking into that. So this is where you see the COVID-19 parallel becomes critical. Just as pandemic diverted development finance for years and reshaped the political priorities, we see quite shrank civil society space as the crisis became stronger. The COVID-19, the CSO funding, and the climate and the space. So actually, many countries in the world, including South Asia, rather than clamping down on the inequality and disparity, they started clamping down on the dissent. So people, when they talk for justice, for the rights, they were being targeted through both online, offline, physical violence. There are renewable alternatives that many colleagues talked. There are solar PVs in Pakistan, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, everywhere. There's a hydropower. I mean, these small dams, not the large ones. There's a big potential of wind. In South Asia, the thing that we miss, as Niti mentioned, ASEAN has a collaborative ASEAN grid. What we miss in South Asia due to the many conflicts. But there's a need to have a cross-border grid. I mean, there are some, Bhutan, India, I believe, is operational. Nepal, India is also growing. But that kind of collaboration needs more, and of course, battery storage and EVs. I think what South Asian governments, the message they can take to Santa Martha, one, of course, is an strong case for make the rich fossil fuel companies to pay more taxes. So disincentivizing the investment in the fossil fuel. And last year we did a research that if we just tax excess profit of 500 plus fossil fuel companies, it can generate $400 billion US in 1 year, more than what is needed for loss and damage annual finance. So that's the one important message. The other one is, as Liddy mentioned, just equitable transitions. And that also means the South Asian governments must be asking a reparation as a climate justice, because we have contributed less and we are facing the major losses. And then third, of course, a clear roadmap to stop fossil fuel dependency. And this war has, of course, generated that momentum, the countries to talk on that. And fourth one is a debt cancellation. Countries in South Asia don't have the fiscal capacity or deep pockets to pay the debts, illegal debts. So there should be a strong demand for that debt cancellation. Harjit, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. That was very rich, and I'm glad you touched a bit about Pakistan, and that's where you are based. I would like to go for a slightly deeper dive on Pakistan and go to Dr. Abid Suleri. So, Dr. Suleri, zooming in on Pakistan a little bit, which has been navigating a fragile economy before the crisis hit. We would like to hear from you, how has the recent surge in global crude prices deepened Pakistan's energy security, and what has been the response? Over to you, Dr. Suleri. Dr. Suleri, if you can unmute, can you hear us? Please unmute yourself. We can't.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, comrades, depending from where you have joined. It's an excellent opportunity to discuss what is working, what's not working in Asia, especially with this Middle East crisis. Thank you, Mustafa, for setting the scene about Pakistan. Now, I feel that this crisis, we need to slightly dig beyond energy. Yes, energy is one of the direct channel through which the Middle East crisis is impacting Asia, but then this energy availability of energy, supply of energy, it doesn't remain confined at petrol pumps. We are talking of high inflation. We are talking of high interest rates. We are talking of food prices going up. We are talking of people's buying capacity, citizens' buying capacity eroding. When we talk of Pakistan, for example, we had an import cover of roughly 2.8 months when the oil was at $70 per barrel. Today, when it's hovering around $100 per barrel, so you can well imagine that import cover that has got eroded, and with this erosion of import cover, which means more dependency on external assistance or loans. It means pressure on value of rupee, which fortunately so far hasn't got reflected, but it certainly mean high inflation. Now at STPI, when we did some scenarios, our this average scenario where we find that oil price would remain volatile and they will fluctuate between $95 per barrel to $130 per barrel. And I'm not talking of Brent, I'm talking of Arabian crude, Arabian light that is mainly imported in Pakistan. So we feel that every $10 rise in the price of oil at $10 per barrel, it directly leads to almost 0.3 to 0.4% in inflation, which means that the inflation, which is now in single digit, one is expecting it to rise in double digit by the end of this year. It also means the interest rate, which right now is 10.5%, it would increase, and it also mean increase in our import bill. The another major challenge is that even if the war ends tomorrow, the time that it would take for supplies to resume is much larger. So we are talking of, for example, Qatar has already declared that in order to compensate for its LNG plant repair, it would take not weeks or months, it would take years. From 3 to 5 years, it would take in order to go back to the pre-war production of gas, which means not only gas for electricity, gas for vehicles, but also gas for fertilizers. Similarly, if one looks at the refinery capacity, it was almost $1 billion per day that the GCC countries they are losing because of the refinery closure. And even if the war stops tomorrow, it would take at least 2 months for the refineries to get back in operation. So far, we hadn't feel the brunt in real terms because there was a lot of oil in the seashore. Now with the current closure of Strait of Hormuz by United States, that's where 187 vessels they are stuck in GCC, and very soon this uh, 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 impact would be realized. Now, with this broader introduction, so what does it mean for our agenda today, and what does it mean for Santa Marta conference? I think it's an excellent opportunity for countries to reduce their reliance on imported fossil fuel. And it's not only the developing countries, it's also the developed countries. For example, there are three very interesting developments to note in United Kingdom during last 1 week. In the month of March only, there is a 45% increase in installed solar capacity in the United Kingdom. Uh, in the month of March, consumers they are relying more on solar than other sources of energy. In the month of March, April, only 2 days ago, the UK has actually changed its law of pricing the energy. It used to be tagged with the gas prices. Now it's being tagged with energy prices. And in the month of March, April, the UK government is actually encouraging the consumer to consume the grid electricity so that they don't have to, and those who will be the major consumers would be provided subsidized electricity. So it's the twin approach. On the one hand, the renewable is being adopted. On the other hand, the fossil fuel consumption is being encouraged and subsidized. And on the third hand, which is very important, it was a demand in UK for long. The prices, electricity prices, they are de-linked with gas prices, and they are being linked with this renewable prices. Now, UK had deep pockets and it can afford it. For the countries like Pakistan or any other countries in South Asia or East Asia, there are three determining factors. One is the dependence on imported fossil fuel. Second is the level of indebtedness. What is the level of external debts? And the third is the fiscal deficit, the gap between revenue and expenditure. So those countries which have high dependency, those countries which have high debt, and those countries which have low revenue and high expenditure, they are more vulnerable to this crisis. And unfortunately, Pakistan was ranked second by The Economist magazine among the vulnerable economies to this. The first one is just for the audience interest, Jordan. Second is Pakistan. Third is Sri Lanka. And then is Egypt and Ethiopia. So these are the four most vulnerable emerging economies to this crisis. Now, the countries, they are shifting their pattern of energy dependency. As I said, that in the short to medium term, those who have the nuclear capacity would be going on nuclear energy. Many of the European countries, they are doing so. Those who have indigenous coal, they will be shifting to coal. And then those who don't have either nuclear or coal, they have this excellent chance to move to renewable. And Pakistan has this excellent chance to move to renewable. Only during last 2 years, we imported 35 gigawatts of solar panel. The uptake of EV is a major breaking story in Pakistan now. With all the sanctions on China and the trade war between China and the United States, the countries of South Asia, I think they are the best consumer right now for Chinese green technology of both solar panel as well as the EVs. Now, the problem lies in two. In case of Pakistan, there are two thorny issues. The first is legacy payment or capacity payment charges that we owe to IPPs. even if we don't buy, we have to pay them due to these historical contracts, and those were the fossil fuel IPPs. We keep on paying them. And in order to actually reduce the burden of capacity payment charges, the government of Pakistan in the last budget, last June, actually imposed taxes on solar panel import, and also reversed the net metering by which prosumers they can export their electricity to the grid. So that net metering is reversed. Now, when we know that this, even if war ends, we know that perhaps the Middle East would remain volatile and fragile. The dependency in imported fossil fuel would have to be reconsidered and rethought, just like it is. Just as I often give this analogy of global travel after 9/11, as it has changed and could never go back to pre-9/11. This fossil fuel dependency after the war would have to change, and it would never go to pre-28th February. So this renewable energy has to be promoted. The Pakistan government has to rethink of taxes on solar panel and net metering, but of course it cannot do it overnight due to legacy payment. It cannot do overnight due to the investing in battery storage, grid connectivity. Right now, battery storage, grid storage, as well as the consumer storage is the largest challenge. So we have to, in the conference in Santa Marta, we are looking forward at a couple of technological assistance point for inclusive and just transition to fossil fuel. And for phasing out of fossil fuel, it is extremely crucial and important to build capacity of the countries, A, in grid connectivity and grid upgrading, B, in grid storage, at a macro level storage, and C, at a prosumer level storage, so that producers, they can produce electricity during daytime, they can store it, and then they can send it back to grid during peak hours. Without these technological assistance, the golden opportunity that are the silver lining from this war, the only good news from this war, reduction in our dependence on imported fossil fuel, will not be possible. So we have to work together on this technological transfer. Thank you very much, Arjit.
Thank you so much, Awad Bhai. And I know we have had a very rich discussion, and I'm going to request our participants to stay on for a few more minutes. We have two more speakers coming up, and I would like to we go to Barish. Barish, we see even Bangladesh struggling, and at the same time, we have seen Bangladesh has invested heavily in fossil fuel infrastructure in the last few years, making it highly vulnerable to exactly these kinds of supply shocks. So how do you think countries impacted right now, and what's going on? So over to you, Barish.
Thank you, Arjit. I think the most potent sign of how it has impacted Bangladesh is found at the petrol pump. Just the other day, my own car went to the petrol pump and it took 12 hours to get 2,000 taka worth of gas, which roughly about 10, 15 liters of gas. And this is a very normal sight now in Dhaka. You see for kilometers, cars, motorcycles have queued up at all times. And there's waiting there for the pump to open. Oftentimes, the pump is not even open, but they're waiting there because they can't give up their spot in line. This is at many times, especially at night, when you see this late at night, it's almost apocalyptic. That the economy is on a precipice, because without desperation, why would someone be doing this? At the same time, you have the government talking about there's no shortage. Whether there is a shortage in absolute numbers or not, a panic has already set in in society about what's happening. And whether that's translating to stockpiling or whether that's translating to genuine scarcity, that needs to be studied. And I don't necessarily know the answer, but it suggests that whatever course of action we're in right now is a very unenviable task for any government to have to take on. We import largely all our almost 100% import dependent. Our petroleum, which is some 80% import dependent. LPG is also very import dependent. And most of it is coming from the Middle East and coming through the Strait of Hormuz. So the supply shock is very acute. In 2022, there was also a supply shock because because Bangladesh was very reliant on buying LNG from the global spot market at that time. And when the war in Russia-Ukraine broke out, the fluctuations in the market led to a situation in which the government of Bangladesh could not buy LNG for 10 months from the global spot market. At that time, I think we also had a lot of the similar narratives. We identified this is the danger of the addiction to fossil fuels. This is the danger of the import dependency of fossil fuels. But their approach at that time was, okay, to avoid this type of thing happening again, we're going to lock in long-term supply contracts. And what has happened since February 28th is all three of the long-term LNG supply contracts that they had, two of them in Qatar, one of them in Oman, have been declared force majeure and are no longer working. Even if you could somehow get the LNG onto a tanker and then send it, the tanker is not being able to cross because of a blockade. And now, according to reports, 2 blockades. So we're repeating kind of 4 years later that, yes, we have an opportunity. And this time, I think it is different because I think the governments also understand that this is not sustainable. Just yesterday, the Prime Minister in Bangladesh made a speech in which he said, we're trying our best to keep prices stable, because he knows that the minute you start raising the fuel prices, you're going to cause an inflationary ripple throughout the economy. But at the same time, when you're having to spend so much money on subsidies to try and keep this price stable, they're now approaching the IMF, the World Bank, the different MFIs for 2 billion in budgetary support for this year to try and keep the prices stable. By some analysis, the inflationary impact of this blockade in Bangladesh could push the inflation rate up to 14%, which would, be quite catastrophic. Over the last 2 years, there was a lot of work done to rebuild the foreign currency reserves, to not end up in a situation that, for example, Sri Lanka ended up a few years ago. All of that is going to be wiped out because you're having to spend that to try and prop up a system that is not sustainable at its core. So, we, as cynical as it may be, because we are talking about the suffering of real human lives, right? We're talking about the livelihoods and real lives when we're talking about who is being impacted by this blockade. But there is an opportunity here to change the narrative. Fossil fuels are clearly being proven to not be reliable. The dependence on fossil fuels is being punished at this moment. And the addiction to fossil fuels, this has to be the wake-up call, that this is clearly not going to work moving forward. So in a way, the Santa Marta conference is happening at a very opportune moment, because when the governments are going to go to Santa Marta, The miss opportune moment of it is, of course, that it's going to be very difficult for them to get to Santa Marta. But the opportune moment is that when they do get to Santa Marta and they're talking about transitioning away from fossil fuels, what a few years ago would have been quite a niche or a charitable topic for many governments, that yes, okay, we'll talk about this to keep civil society happy, now is going to be a lot more serious for them, because they'll realize that this is not going to work, moving forward. This type of geopolitical shock can happen at any time, and it doesn't have to be a war. It doesn't. These straits can end up, uh, unnavigable for many different reasons, and that relying on this sort of global energy market is not going to lead to energy security, let alone energy sovereignty, which I think is coming up more and more and more in many of the countries in Asia, in their rhetoric and in their thinking. And this is not going to be limited to energy. In Bangladesh, I think we're already feeling that. And I think this is what I am particularly most worried about at the moment, is what happens if this impacts the agricultural sector. Everything else, yes, of course, there's suffering when an economic downturn happens, but when people go hungry, that's when danger can begin, right? 4 out of 5 big fertilizer plants have shut down because there's no urea being able to come through. The only state-owned refinery in Bangladesh has also slowed production, or there's a lot of talk about it closing production temporarily because there's no supply of crude. And what happens when the farmers are going to be planting for the new harvest and you don't have diesel for irrigation pumps, or you have a supply chain break because you can't get fuel for transport to bring materials or carry goods from the farms back to the markets. This is where I think the danger really lies. That how do we solve these issues? The thing is that this is not impossible to solve with renewable energy. The solutions already do exist, but they've not been taken super seriously by the governments. I think we heard from our colleagues in Pakistan, but Pakistan has been lauded as one of the success stories in the last few years of renewables deployment. In fact, there was an article in Nikkei Asia just recently about how Pakistan's solar boom has mitigated some of the effects in a way that Bangladesh has lost out on because we did not pursue this type of renewables seriously. $12 billion, I think, was the number that Pakistan has been able to avoid paying out, $12 billion since 2018. $12 billion would be very useful for Bangladesh at this moment, I hope that they will realize that the solutions exist. For example, with irrigation, solar irrigation was trialed in Bangladesh, but has not yet been popularized because it still exists in a government pilot program or NGO-led programs rather than becoming a sort of market solution. And I think the structural changes to enable renewables to compete in the market is one of the main things that I hope not only that our government will see, but will be discussed at the Santa Marta conference. Because subsidies and propping up of the fossil fuel addiction is a major concern. And I think this is really the moment we have an opportunity now to change the narrative of what does energy security and energy sovereignty mean, because it does not mean dependence on imported fossil fuels. Thank you, Harjeet.
Thank you so much, Barish, for all those nuances and talking about challenges, but also opportunities and where the missed opportunities were and how we can really influence our policymakers. I would like to now go to Megha Maskey, who's the Asia campaigner. Megha, you are in Nepal. You are from Nepal, and we have had some very interesting conversations over the last few days on just transition and, of course, responding to the current challenges. I would like to request you to briefly touch upon that and also talk about what are the expectations that Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative has from the Santa Marta conference. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Harjeet. Well, first to start off, Nepal has no oil wells or any other sources of fossil fuels. So it relies almost entirely on India for its fuel supplies. So there's a lot of this structural dependence on imported petroleum products, which is a major component of the country's budget. In the last fiscal year alone, petroleum import itself totaled around $1.8 billion. And this has significantly contributed to a trade deficit of over $15 billion. And following the war and fuel shortage, aviation fuel prices have doubled, and even the cooking gas cylinders were being sold only half filled last month to discourage hoarding up and panic buying. And the government decided to also extend its weekends to both Saturday and Sundays from its originally six working day to cope with the energy crisis. So the effect is widespread, like every other country at this point. And also other structural barriers like high debt burdens, lack of climate finance, gap in technology and capacity building makes it even more difficult to deal with energy crisis. But I also think that we need to move our narrative from victimhood to leadership. We've always said how vulnerable we are, and we are. And of course, we should continue demanding for equity based rights and loss and damage and all that. But we're also making strides in clean energy and fulfilling some main climate commitments. Almost all of our electricity is generated from hydropower, even though they are largely based on river systems which lack sufficient storage capacity, causing seasonal imbalance, but it's still powering the country. And then 3.7 million households now have clean cooking stoves, and this is only increasing. And this is critical because still about 65% of the population depend on traditional firewood. EVs account for over 70% of private vehicles now. As a result, even though fuel prices have hiked, it has a greater effect on diesel based engine than petrol ones. And plus, we have very recently passed a bill to convert diesel and petrol engines into electric. And there's also a local policy in Tillikhel municipality, which is a signatory of the Fossil Fuel Treaty, that states that new industries can only run from clean energy. And in the preparation of Santa Marta conference, Nepal has not only organized one but two such consultation meetings on transitioning away from fossil fuels. And that was organized by the Ministry of Forest and Environment, which shows that the government is trying to take ownership. So Nepal has the option to be self-sufficient on energy, in theory at least, putting aside the structural and political barriers. But for us, energy transition is not just transitioning away from fossil fuels, it is equitable energy access. You know, who has the electricity reach, who is driving the electric vehicle, who got a free induction stove, and about justice, be it the workers in the brick factories or the communities whose land is being taken away to build hydropower dams. So putting the just in the energy transition is an absolute must. And the global energy crisis should not paralyze us, but I say it should mobilize us to prove that even a landlocked, import dependent nation can chart a path towards equitable, sovereign, and just energy future. And talking about fossil fuel treaty and our expectation, just to give a little background about that, well, you know, the Santa Marta conference happening next week is a huge historic turning point in climate diplomacy to achieve this just energy future. And because for over 3 decades, global climate negotiations have focused on managing emissions while ignoring its root cause, which is the unchecked proliferation of oil, gas, and coal. And the Fossil Fuel Treaty can be an essential tool, a binding international framework to drive a global just transition to decentralized, accessible, renewable energy for all by stopping the expansion of fossil fuels and managing an equitable phase out. So the question is not about whether a fossil fuel treaty will happen, but which nations will be at the table when it does. And so far, 18 nations have already endorsed it, over 140 subnational governments, and millions of individuals are on board. So we expect Santa Marta to be a very crucial platform to truly advance international cooperation on fossil fuels. And our call is very straightforward, is to recognize the need of a new international agreement on transitioning away from fossil fuels, because currently there are no such explicit legal obligations on the production end. And then to establish an intersessional dialogue on the pathway towards such an agreement. And third, commit to a dedicated conference work stream outside the Paris Agreement on such initiation for an instrument at the second conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels in the Pacific. So I'll stop here. Thank you, Harjeet.
Thank you so much, Megha, and you have very succinctly not only talked about the challenges from Nepal, but also what needs to happen and connecting that with treaty. I know we are well over time, but if our participants are willing to stay for a few more minutes, we are available for any questions that you have. I can see that Lani has already shared our press release, and you can reach out to Lani and Becca for any further follow-up questions, but here's also some space for us to have Q&A. So you can raise your hand and you can type your question, or we'll give you the opportunity to speak. So that option is available as well. So if you have any questions, please come forward and raise your hand. Or you can type in.
How did you, Lauren Croft has a hand up?
Hi, this is Lauren with Energy Intelligence.
Yeah.
I'm a journalist, and thank you all for having this. And I was wondering if there's a difference of opinion among you or among those who are participating that you are aware of at the first conference about what the outcome could be in terms of the type of tool. Should it be a treaty? Are there some who would like it to look like more of a roadmap? Is there some kind of is that not really settled yet, or is there kind of a alignment toward one option or the other?
Thank you, Lauren, for that question. Is there any other question? If not, we can respond to yours. Okay, probably I can start. So Lauren, you are right. I would say it's not settled, but let's also understand that things have changed dramatically over the last few months. When this conference was agreed, we were in a different context. We didn't have war in this region, and the impacts that you have heard from all the panelists from talking about the region, and of course we see those ripples throughout the world. So as Colombia said initially, and its co-host the Netherlands, that it's not a negotiating space. And this is where we are going to have a conversation on forging a path forward on how do we deal with the issue. And we'll talk about solutions. And the kind of work streams they're talking about, how to reduce dependency, but they're also talking about international cooperation. Now, having seen the context changing, it is time to relook at what the outcomes could be. Of course, we are not saying that this space should become a negotiating space, as we have seen in UNFCCC, but the conversations have to now be far more concrete. Yes, we need to talk about solutions, but we also need to talk about a pathway that should take us towards that global governance that has been missing on equitably phasing out fossil fuels in a just and orderly manner. And that's where the treaty conversation becomes even more important. And let me also say this conference is over and above treaty. Of course, fossil fuel treaty played a key role in agreeing to have this conference and remains a core part of it. But the conversations are going to be over and above and looking at various dimensions. Fossil fuel treaty is one of the pathways, and we have seen a huge momentum, as my colleague Mega talked about. So we are having a discussion on what should be the next step. Of course, there's going to be an announcement on the second conference, which is going to be in the Pacific, hosted by Tuvalu. But we would also like to see a clear work stream where this conversation can be taken forward. So it cannot be a one-off conversation. So, and we need to have a clear pathway on what's going to happen in the second one and how we are going to actually address the gap in the global governance. That's the key question, Lauren. I hope I responded, and I also invite other panelists to come in, and feel free, Lauren, if you have a follow-up question.
And thank you, Harjeet. I guess what do you mean by it's not a space for negotiating? Is it meant to be a little bit more informal, open-minded, whether you or anyone?
So, as you know, 18 nations have already supported the call for a fossil fuel treaty, and we are expecting more and more countries to join. What we do anticipate that we are going to have a work stream as part of the overall initiative as this first conference to have a continued work on looking at, as I said, the governance gap and the role a fossil fuel treaty can play. That's being expected as one of the outcomes beyond those three work streams that the organizers, Colombian government and the Netherlands have put forth. So, of course, we would like to see that, and not that all the negotiations are going to happen in Colombia, but starting a work stream. That's our expectation, definitely.
Thank you so much.
Harjeet, if I may add,
Sure.
Abid here. Yeah, you see, one has seen that era of multilateralism is fast eroding, and now it's all about minilateralism. And what we saw in WTO ministerial conference few months ago, whereby around 66 countries, they basically agreed on this licensing fee for digital services, vetoing, not vetoing, but of course, while US and many other developed countries, they were not endorsing it, but they unilaterally decided to implement it, and it is against the WTO rule of all are convinced, all agreed, or no one agrees. But this is the micro or the mini lateralism that one is observing now, and I think Santa Marta is also one of those opportunities whereby it would be a coalition of willings. It doesn't have to be a broader treaty, but I think gradually, as Harjeet said, this critical mass is developing, and it's the consumer actually who would be forcing their governments to join such treaties when they would have to feel the brunt of price of imported fossil fuel. Thank you, Harjeet.
Thank you so much, Abid. Any other question or contribution? Niti, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that this is the beginning of it's a momentous occasion, and it's a beginning of a journey with great potential, significant potential. And I just wanted to say that while noting that there are two countries in Southeast Asia, which are part of the 18 countries which have expressed support for the treaty initiative, Cambodia and Timor-Leste, I'm very confident that Southeast Asia will probably play host for the third international conference and keep the momentum going on this.
Thank you so much, Niti. Okay, I don't see any other hand, and we are massively over time, and I see a lot of people still stayed back. So that shows that discussion was very rich. And thank you very much for staying. And as we heard from all the panelists, that the challenges are immense, and it has really pushed all of us back to the drawing board. We are looking at policies which worked, which did not work, learning from each other, and also recognizing that we have to move away from fossil fuels in a much more faster manner, and of course respecting the principles of equity, justice, energy access, and that is absolutely fundamental. And as Barish said, Santa Mata, which was planned to happen at this time, but look at how it coincided with the crisis that we are facing. We need to make it a real opportunity now to have a much more decisive roadmap or a pathway, whatever we call it, to make sure that we are fixing the global governance gap. We are working in a much more coordinated manner, and then we also make sure that there is a legal obligation on countries to act. And of course, developed countries have a huge role to play to bring down their emissions and provide finance and technology to developing nations so that they can also adopt more and more renewable energy and move away from their dependence on fossil fuels. So many of us that you see on this panel, and I'm sure from participants, are going to Santa Marta. We are going to do our best to push our governments and make this conference a success, and something very concrete in terms of next steps should emerge. And that's what we are hoping for, and that's how we are going to engage with our governments, and a massive push from the civil society and grassroots movements. Thank you once again, everybody, for joining, and thank you to my colleagues Zoe, Becca, Lani, and others for organizing and helping us bring everybody together. Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists and
everyone.
participants.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harjeet,
Thank you.
and all the
Bye-bye.
participants.
Thank you.
Great conversation.
Bye.